I'm Josh Barrow, host of Left, Right, and Center, KCRW's weekly forum for civilized debate across the political spectrum. Today's news cycle demands more time for deeper analysis, so Left, Right, and Center is now a full hour every week. Subscribe and listen at kcrw.com/LRC.
On To The Point, we try to make sense of the policy debates and the political sideshows on the campaign trail.
Donald Trump is probably the most significant thing to happen to the religious right in a few decades.
OMG, this guy is actually a bigot.
If she becomes president, no one since Richard Nixon would have been on the national stage that long and won the White House.
I'm Warren Olney. To The Point has you covered for the 2016 campaign. Find the To The Point podcast on KCRW's iTunes page.
From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, it's The Treatment. Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. I guess the thing I've always thought real criticism was about in any field is finally enthusiasm and maybe some intensity too. And that's something you find in the work of my guest, Owen Gleiberman, who was with Entertainment Weekly from its inception in 1990 to 2014. He's published his autobiography. The book is Movie Freak. First of all, Owen, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, man, it's great to be here, Elvis.
It's good to have you. And one of the fun things about reading the book is seeing you mentioned a movie in the very beginning that I didn't think anybody else had ever seen, a movie called The Penthouse.
1967. It's a movie like no one's ever heard of, although I found that I had to, when I wanted to see it again, I had to kind of work to find a DVD copy of it. And now you can just watch it on YouTube. But it's one of the movies that my parents took me and my younger brothers to see in the late 60s at a drive-in theater. My dad in particular had developed sort of a taste. He wasn't that much of a movie buff, but he was, you know, a philanderer and other things, and he kind of developed a taste for the new adult cinema that Hollywood was starting to turn out in 1967, 1968. So in those two summers, we went to a lot of drive-in movies, and when I was 8 and 9 years old, I saw these films that were hugely inappropriate for a kid my age to be seeing, like The Boston Strangler, Rosemary's Baby. I say in the book that I got to watch The Devil Rape Rosemary before I knew what the devil or rape was. And The Penthouse, which was this 1967 shocker from Britain that was basically about two people having an affair in their love nest, and then these two thugs break into the apartment and spend 90 minutes torturing and terrorizing this couple.
As you mentioned, it's the funny games of the 60s.
Totally. And it was the first movie like that I had ever seen. I was 8 years old, and I think in some ways, I joke in the book that my parents taking us to see these movies and hoping that we would fall asleep, but I never did, was borderline child abuse. And I think for another kid, if I'd been a different person, it might have been very traumatizing. But instead, I was not traumatized. I was fascinated. I sat there in the back seat and kind of plugged right into the adult subject matter of these films. And there were a couple of moments in Rosemary's Baby that were upsetting, gave me nightmares for a couple of nights. But watching movies like The Penthouse or even The Boston Strangler, which does invite you as a movie to have this kind of queasy identification with the protagonist, with the strangler himself. I felt that as a kid. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was just drawn to these films. And I think it fed a lifelong feeling for me about movies that almost the ultimate thing movies could be was to give you the feeling that they were drawing back the curtain on these dark, forbidden, alluring, intoxicating worlds. That's not the only thing that a movie can do, but I think that that is hugely built into the nature of movies. I mean, it was right there in film noir in the 40s. Movies have always held out the promise of the forbidden and that kind of revelation. And that's the side of it that's always, you know, spoke to me the most profoundly. And I think it started at the drive-in when I was a kid.
I just was really impressed by that section you write about the Boston Strangler, because that really sort of touches on a lot of who and what you are, as we see later in the book, that idea of as he's basically tying up Sally Kellerman and looks sort of, Tony Curtis catches a glance of himself in the mirror and is kind of sickened by it. That idea of being in the moment and observing a moment is pretty much kind of the watch phrase of the book.
It's true. It's true. You're inside it and outside it at the same time. I mean, that is the peculiar metaphysic almost of being a critic. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that, a lot of people will ask you, how did you become a critic? Why did you become a critic? It really is something that chose me. I think by the time I figured out in college that this is what I wanted to do, and then after I got to know Pauline Kael, really sort of, was able to kind of be lucky enough to jump into the career of being a film critic. I felt at that point that that's what I was. That's what I'd always been. I have this relentlessly analytical nature where, I'm trying to use ideas and figuring out how things work as a way of connecting to people almost, and a way of connecting to movies. And so I think I always was a critic. I was just kind of made this way.
There's also that thing that analysis that movie touches on that runs through the book, that idea of wanting to find something bigger than you,
right,
but also to be able to be outside it enough to write about it or to observe it at the same time, which is really what being a critic is about, isn't it?
Totally. But, I think a lot of people have, kind of limited ideas of what a critic is. People think being a critic is being a consumer guide, or the stereotype that is still with us from Addison DeWitt and All About Eve, that the critic is the snooty, witty, deep down unhappy person who is using his role as a way of taking out this vengeance on the world. I never bought into that idea of criticism because I always led with my enthusiasms. And, Pauline Kael, when I read my first Pauline Kael movie review, it was of Carrie in 1976, the Brian De Palma film. I think that review changed my life because she reinvented what criticism was. It became this form about trying to capture the movie on the page. She almost made criticism into a new form for the reality era. And as soon as I read that piece and then, started just to become addicted to her writing, I thought, this is what I wanted to do. And it was different from what other critics had done. It was all about enthusiasm. It was all about connecting. That doesn't mean that it's not fun sometimes to take down a movie, but for me, criticism was always about trying to get deeply into the things that I loved.
It's the treatment. I'm talking to Owen Gleiberman, who many of us know from his time at Entertainment Weekly. He's now at the BBC, and his new book, Movie Freak, deals with his entire life and the way just keeping an eye on pop culture and oneself, these things can be intertwined. And that those enthusiasms go from Jimmy Mack and the Cowsills to later on Oliver Stone, just these things that awaken these passions in you.
Well, absolutely. I always responded heavily to the light and dark sides of pop culture. But look, I do try to intertwine in Movie Freak my movie love and my personal life. And I try to be candid about it. I felt I sort of owed that to the reader because I wanted to talk about who I was as an individual. If there's any theme of the book, aside from movie passion, it's the idea of what I really think criticism is about. Yes, it's about enthusiasm. But I also think criticism is about individuality. That's what I so responded to in Pauline Kael's writing. She was such a fearless individual. Even if you were an obsessive fan of hers, each week you could never predict what she was going to say. And that's because she just spoke from the heart, from the gut. And that's the kind of criticism I believe in. I make the case in the book that there is now trouble in the land of film criticism. And it's not that because of the rise of digital culture, everyone's now a critic and real critics have lost their power or their influence or maybe even their jobs. A lot of people talk about that stuff these days, and that's all going on. But I think the real problem in criticism is that that situation has created an incredible caution among critics where they are scared of losing their jobs, and a kind of groupthink has set in because there's safety in numbers. And I think critics are now looking to please their audiences, please each other, and go with the flow more. And I think that's a violation of the spirit of individuality that I always thought was really the defining thing about criticism. So one of the things I wanted to talk about in this book is the individual that I am, to show how you become the kind of critic that you are.
You mentioned that in the book. There's a section you're talking to one of your editors at EW, and there's a point where you realize that your reaction to Apollo 13 wasn't what had been carved in stone in the culture about it. And you guys started talking. You said he just sort of came with a phrase or a personage, Meteor Mike, who just sort of basically stamps out these opinions and everybody seems to sort of step in line with them.
Yeah, Media Mike is like this guy who's sitting in a room. He's like Big Brother's assistant. He's sitting in a room with headphones on and a microphone, and he kind of sends out the word to everybody. And I first did kind of get onto this around the time of Apollo 13 because I didn't think it was a terrible movie, but I was kind of mixed on it. I thought for all the craftsmanship on display, it was a little repetitive. And then all these reviews started coming out, one after another, rhapsodizing about it. I don't remember that kind of rapture over the right stuff, which I thought was a much better movie about space travel. And
maybe messier, not as organized, but a much more deeply felt movie about
That's right.
heroism.
And I didn't begrudge any one critic loving Apollo 13, but I was deeply suspect of the uniformity of opinion. And now I think, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this in the book is because I wanted to cue readers to kind of see, yes, isn't that out there? I've had a lot of response in that way. People have said, yes, I never thought about Media Mike till you started talking about it.
But the thing, I think if you do begrudge anything, is that the lack of investment that seems to exist in a lot of modern criticism, that idea of, well, let's just step in line.
Well, I think that if you're not expressing who you are completely as an individual, then it's not real criticism. I mean, it may be serving the function of it, but movie reviewing, as Pauline Kael defined it, I think, and as I've continued to try to do it, is about just being true to what you thought about something, regardless of what anybody else thinks. And I think the second you're holding up your finger to the wind and kind of sussing out other people's opinions and getting in line, you violated the job. I mean, I think you're not doing the job any more than if you're a postman who's opening somebody's mail. But I think there are tremendous pressures on critics now from editors who want to serve the corporate machine, the Hollywood entertainment machine. But I was able to avoid that. I have been able to avoid it so far.
Well, so much of the book, though, is about you finding a way, especially in the first half, to articulate these passions that you have. And that, to me, is the fascinating stuff, figuring out why you react to things and why that is specific to you, but also finding a way to voice those things. So that's the hard thing to do, too.
Well, yeah, and I talk all through the book about the kinds of films that I got drawn to and almost addicted to, maybe, carrying over that spirit from the drive-in. But films like Michael Mann's Manhunter or Blue Velvet or Natural Born Killers or Breaking the Waves or Boogie Nights, these films that would just get inside my system. And I found that I was watching them not just 2 or 3 times or 5 times, but 10 times, 20 times, 30 times. I started playing them like albums. And I think that also feeds into one of the ways that movies still, for me, transcend television, if I can dare to say that in this day and age. It seems like the idea that television is now officially better than movies has so taken over. I don't argue at all with the rise of television. I'm an absolute devotee of shows like Sopranos or Mad Men or Breaking Bad. But I think that there's a lot of serial television that can just hook you because people like the serial nature of it. But I think that movies at their best, and I still think people are making extraordinary films, even in the franchise era, movies have a kind of primal power that transcends that. And I'm not just talking about the fact that you're watching it in a theater, but, you look at a movie like Todd Haynes' Carol or the Mad Max film from last year in very different ways. I think those films are operating on levels that even the best series television, I would argue, is not. They just have...
There's an emotional scale.
They have a visual and emotional power that is very deep, that is very primordial. And that's what we always wanted from movies. The idea that serial television, because of its multi-episode nature, attains a complexity that movies don't have. Sure, if you're comparing it to some franchise popcorn. But in a way, that argument is specious in that it would undermine the complexity of all the great movies of the last 100 years. I mean, whether you're looking at classic Hollywood or Dog Day Afternoon or Nashville or Carrie or Boogie Nights, none of those movies needed to be 1 minute longer than they were to attain a timeless complexity. So I think that, though I agree that we're in the high Renaissance era of television, who would dispute that? I think movies, great movies, have gotten a little bit of short shrift. I think what has really changed is people's viewing habits. The small screen is now so attractive that what a lot of people are saying is, well, I'd rather just stay home and binge watch rather than go out to the movies where it's noisy and you have to pay this much and all of that. Yeah, but when you see a really great movie, and people are still making them, it takes you back to that era, the 70s, the 90s, whatever. That stuff has never gone away.
It's a great point to take a break. My guest is Owen Gleiberman. His book is Movie Freak. It's the treatment. There's more to come. Stay with us.
Long before podcasts, there were radionovelas. Celestial Blood is the first ever to combine the two. One version in English and another one in Spanish. Listen with your grandma, only from KCRW.
Listen to KCRW's Music Stream Eclectic 24 for hand-picked music around the clock. You can find all of KCRW's produced content on our app. Download for free at kcrw.com/apps.
Welcome back. It's The Treatment. I'm talking to a man with tastes that range all over the place because that's what pop culture does for us. It excites us and we find surprise in things we don't expect to find those surprises in. He's Owen Gleiberman. His book is Movie Freak. I want to get back to the book a little bit because something we both have in common is this thing that kind of separates you and it does make you an observer in your own life is when you're promoted in school. I was skipped a couple grades and you were too. And that thing it does to you is you can see what you left behind as you're trying to adapt to this world that you've suddenly been thrown into that you probably were ready for, but you shouldn't have made that step.
Well, that's right. It's funny. I didn't know that about you, Elvis, that you skipped 2 grades? Oh, wow. You're just like the kid in Almost Famous. And
so you apparently, based on the book.
I talk about that, about how my mother was like the Frances McDormand character saying, who needs kindergarten? You're ahead of those other kids. And I actually made that I went to kindergarten for 6 weeks, got skipped out of it, and made the transition pretty seamlessly. But you have the same experience I had when they come and they take you out of the class. That's right.
And you don't know what's going on, but suddenly you feel like you're because whenever in kindergarten, when you're being pulled out, there's got to be something wrong, and there's a kind of ominousness. And I read that section of the book. I actually felt like the goose pimples on my neck.
I compared it to the opening credits of that show Branded, where the guy is basically, cashiered out of the army. And it's like, what makes you so different? It took me years, though, to realize that it's not that it was so traumatic to suddenly go into the first grade, but that I had missed something. I had missed the pure socialization that kindergarten was then. I mean, kindergarten is different now. I have a daughter in kindergarten, and she's learning how to read, and it's all about getting ahead already, so that you can start that application to Yale. But it wasn't like that when we were growing up. And in some ways, I think it did put me at a disadvantage in terms of connecting with other kids. I always had friends, but I always felt a little disconnected. And I think a lot of critics do. And for me, being a movie freak, being a critic has always been my skewed form of connection, and I think of attempting to connect. And I think a theme that runs through the book is that coming from the difficult family I had with a very distant, bullying, philandering father.
And a mother who basically had no real confidence in herself, even though she should have.
That's right. I mean, I had, in some ways, a good relationship with my mother, but she was kind of using me as a surrogate for herself, wanting to push me ahead. Having those sorts of problematic family things, I cleaved onto movies as a way of connecting. And at first, it was really odd, and this is one of the things I wanted to talk about that I had not read before, about what being a movie buff, a movie freak is really all about. And one of the things that started to happen to me when I was in college, the thing that turned me on to all this, there were 2 films my freshman year, Carrie and Nashville. I saw those films, and Nashville especially, I thought about it every day, all day long. I mean, not every single second of the day, but for great portions of the day, for like 5 months. This was a real obsession. I was living inside the movie. And so movies became for me a primal way of connecting. At the same time, movies were so much about, in the 70s when I came of age, these feelings of alienation and disconnection that were going on in the society. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how Nashville, for instance, one of the reasons I think it spoke to me so much is that it was made in 1975. It's the great portrait of America at that time. But seen 40 years later, it almost presaged the internet era in terms of it being about the fragmentation of America, in terms of it being
reality TV, that beginning of that appetite for fame, disconnect from talent.
Absolutely. And the sense of these characters, these 24 characters running around Nashville in a very exuberant and joyful way, and yet talking at each other rather than to each other. I mean, in some ways, it really did presage the whole kind of babbling spirit of internet culture.
Well, I think, by the way, one of the things that fascinates me, and this goes from that social separation of being skipped a grade and looking for your place, is that year of Reservoir Dogs and The Crying Game. It was like you kind of waiting for your class to catch up with you in some ways.
Totally. Well, I talk about my basic experiences as a critic in the 80s and 90s. I went to work for the Boston Phoenix in 1981, the week I turned 22. And I had a great experience there, writing for an alternative weekly back when those papers were really flush. Was just the greatest place to hone your chops.
And you could be a young person coming out of school and getting one of those jobs as compared to now those jobs are impossible to get for young people.
Right. Those jobs have disappeared. I mean, I used to tell people for years, when I would talk to classes, people wanted to become critics, I would say try the alternative weeklies. Now all you can say is try blogging and say what you believe, but don't expect to get any money for it. But then in the second half of the 80s, when I became the lead critic of the Phoenix, what I was really hungering for was, could we have a resurgence of what we had in the 70s? And lo and behold, we could. And the reason I cite those two films, Reservoir Dogs, almost obviously, in terms of the Tarantino, the revolution he represented, but The Crying Game less obviously, because The Crying Game also was a new version of a kind of old Hollywood movie.
But one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, you very kindly said something about me in the book, which I was shocked when I saw, because I had no idea you even paid attention to me at any of these places.
I did. It was so much fun to actually be able to write about you. And I actually didn't know what you would think of what I was a little nervous about it. But actually, if it's okay, could I read what I wrote about you in the book?
Thank God I can't blush on radio. Yes, please.
But I see you blushing. Okay. This section is, I wrote a chapter about film festivals, about going to film festivals and the whole drill of that and why it is really fun. But I have one section where I talk about my secrets for how to navigate a festival. And there are...
Don't see too many movies.
I have 5 clues. One is see only 3 movies a day. That's kind of a scandal because everyone at festivals is like, oh, I saw 5 movies today. And, I'm considered a little bit of a slacker there. But it's partly because I have a short attention span. And if I've done 4 movies in a day, but when I get to the 4th one, it's probably trying my patience. And I feel that's not fair to the movie. So I usually try to limit it to 3 a day and know that I'm giving my full attention to all of them. Rule number 2 is seek out any documentary about rock and roll or porn. That's just my kind of thing, but I find that those always work as great palate cleansers. The number 3 is take the meals as seriously as you do movies. Nobody eats at festivals, but I find that if you actually get some sustenance and eat some things you like, you will be happier and you will be more responsive to the films. See, this is all about serving the movies. That's what I do.
And actually very common sense rules.
Absolutely. And number 5 is the whole system wants you to be afraid, very afraid of a Sundance crowd pleaser. Don't be. And this is the little section where I talk about how when you're at a place like Sundance, or actually other festivals as well, there will be these, you're seeing great movies, but there'll be these movies that come along that are crowd pleasers and for the wrong reasons. Like at Sundance.
It's almost the media mic phenomenon at a film festival.
It is, but it's not only that everybody loves them, it's that you're at this festival to try to seek out bold new voices, and the movie that looks like a television show is what everyone loves, because that's what they really want to be doing, is being at home watching that on TV. And, Little Miss Sunshine is probably the Citizen Kane of Sundance crowd pleasers, and some people love it, but I don't know. I thought it was a phony baloney movie. I couldn't deal with it. I've seen it twice. The Way Back, that's another example. But then my number 4 rule for how to navigate a film festival is always hang out with Elvis Mitchell. So let me read this section.
Okay.
Elvis is a friend, albeit a mostly long-distance one, who is one of the most compelling and mysterious figures in the universe of movie criticism. He hosts a weekly public radio talk show out of Los Angeles, but over the decades he has held and then left voluntarily more jobs than most of us have ever applied for, the most prominent one being that of film critic for the New York Times. Elvis is an insightful bebop maestro of a critic, a bon vivant, an iconic figure in his long graying dreadlocks, and an enigmatic hustler survivor who seems to spend his entire life out of a whirlwind of frequent flyer miles and friendships with prestigious maitre d's. That last item being a tad ironic, since I have never shared a meal with Elvis in which I saw him do anything other than order an entree and eat maybe 2 bites of it. Elvis also possesses the rare ability to ingratiate himself into any situation on Earth. If I told him, get a job at the White House, he'd have one in 6 months. and would probably quit it 6 months later. At a festival, Elvis is always the star, with women he has never met approaching him like groupies. When you're with him, you will always wind up at a better party and be privy to more gossip and film insight than you would with anyone else. It's really a pleasure to be able to read that on your show. Now you know. Now you know the real Elvis.
Yes, that's going to go on my tombstone, hustler survivor. Well, I always wanted to be called one of those.
I was wondering how you would react to that, and also the thing about the meals. But I thought, oh, God, I hope that doesn't bug Elvis. But you said you were cool with it, so that's right.
I don't know what to say except to thank you for saying that. I really like the book because it's the things we're talking about here. That idea of being kind of a lost soul who's sort of caught between two things, because that really is in some ways what criticism is about, sort of being caught between the world of involvement and the world of commenting on what you're being involved with.
Well, Elvis, you just used a great phrase that I have not heard anyone else use, and I actually am really glad that you did. You said that the book was a portrait of a lost soul, and I think that if I put that on the cover, I wouldn't sell any books. But in a way it is. In a way, what I'm saying, I have one section where I talk about how to be a good critic, this sounds like the most goofy thing you ever heard, but to be a good critic, you need to be a happy person. And what I'm sort of arguing against there is the stereotype of Addison DeWitt, the critic who's just taking out his vengeance on the world and is just a sourpuss. And that stereotype is still so with us. It was there in that, drunken New York Times critic in Birdman. And that whole image of the critic, I just think, lives on in people. But what I say is that actually, to be a good critic, you need to be the opposite of that. You need to be happy so that when you walk into a screening room and you see a movie and it's not working for you, you know in your heart it's not you. It's not your dyspepsia. It's the movie. And I haven't always been a happy person, but in some ways, I've always been a joyful person. I really feel that, life is kind of a gift. We're just lucky to be walking around here, and I kind of feel that every day. And so I always had that to ballast me, and in a way, I always found that through art. At the same time, I was kind of a lost soul for a long time, and one of the things I really wanted to put out there in the book is that movies were a compensation for me, even though they ended up being a great job and I ended up really lucking out in being able to become a critic. They were a form of connection. They were in a way, substituting for the love I didn't get at home or whatever. And it's kind of about my journey out of that. It's about how after a while, I realized I couldn't live like that forever. I think that living through art can redeem you, can save you, but I think there's also a danger in that.
And you now have a very happy life.
I do. I'm married. I cover that in the book, how I met my wife, and we bonded over the fact that neither one of us had liked Moulin Rouge the first time we saw it, and we both loved it the second time. It was just kind of an interesting coincidence, especially because it's such a romantic movie. And I have 2 daughters, so I did luck out in that I came through the other side of movie fanaticism. And there's one point in the book where I had already met Sharon, the woman who'd become my wife, but it wasn't clear that we were going to stay together. And I started thinking about, who I was in terms of being this movie freak. And I had always seen movies as this powerful, positive force in my life. But then I realized something about them, that they're not real, that in a way I was someone who worshipped false images, almost undead images. I almost worshipped them more than I did life. And that was really a moment of reckoning for me. It didn't stop me from loving movies. I'll always love movies. But it was about putting them in their place a little more. It was about retreating from the danger of film fanaticism, which is that it can be a substitute for life that just overwhelms life. And yet, plunging into that defined who I was.
And we're out of time. I can't thank you enough for doing this. I'm not sure to think about that section of the book, but
it was fun to write. I may write a whole book about you.
No, you won't. But thanks for doing it. My guest is Owen Gleiberman. His book, The Joyous Book, is Movie Freak. Again, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Elvis.
Completely my pleasure. Also my pleasure to thank our old friend Paul West here at the Argo Studios, who's the recording engineer for us here today. The show is mixed by Kat Yor, is edited by Blake White, who's associate producer. I'm in a book. It's The Treatment. To catch up on past episodes of The Treatment, go to KCRW.com or listen on your smartphone with KCRW's mobile apps, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.